small business, you've probably heard of GDPR. You've probably got a privacy policy somewhere, maybe something on your website, and there's a general sense that it's something you've dealt with at some point. And if you're honest, it's probably not something you think about very often. It isn't for most of us business owners. It's one of those things that kind of casually sits in the background. You know it exists, you know it matters in some way, but it doesn't feel like something that affects your day-to-day decision making. And that's usually where people get caught out when it comes to GDPR. Because GDPR tends to get treated as something separate from the business itself. Something you sort out once, maybe when you set things up, and then you move on from and don't really think about again. But it doesn't really work like that when it comes to GDPR. It's not a document, it's not a policy, it's not a one-off exercise. It's about what your business is actually doing every day without really thinking about it. At its simplest, GDPR is about how you handle personal data. That's all it is. That's all it really means. If your business is collecting, storing, or using personal data in any way, then GDPR will apply to you. I've heard many people say it doesn't, it does. And when you actually stop and think about it, most businesses will fall into that category. If someone's filling out a contact form on your website or a landing page, that's personal data. If you have an email list, that's personal data. If you have employees, contractors, clients, suppliers, all of that involves personal data. So straight away, the idea that GDPR is only relevant for big companies starts to fall away. It's not about the size of your business, it's about what you are doing, what data you're collecting. And what GDPR is trying to do is actually quite reasonable, as annoying as it seems. It's saying if you're collecting information about people, you should be clear about why you're collecting it, you should use it properly, and you shouldn't be doing things with it that people wouldn't expect you to do. So that's the general principle. Where it becomes more complicated is how that plays out in real business, real world scenarios. Because most businesses don't sit down and design their data processes from scratch, they evolve, they change over time. You start doing something in a certain way, it works, you build on it, you add tools, systems, people, and over time things just grow. And data is part of that. You start collecting it because you need it. Then you use it in slightly different ways. Then you store it in slightly different places. And then more people get access to it, or you might use it for something different. And none of that really will feel like a problem to you. It just feels like running your business. But that's where the gap starts to build and we start to have a bit of a problem. Because what's actually happening in the business gradually moves away from what's been documented or from what's been thought through properly. And that gap does often go unnoticed by the people running the business until someone asks a question. And that's usually the moment where things shift from feeling theoretical to actually feeling quite real and, oh, this could have an impact here. Because up until that point, GDPR feels like something external, something regulatory, something that sits outside the business. But when someone asks, for example, what data do you hold on me? Or why are you using my information in this way? You're suddenly looking at your own processes a little bit more closely and you might not like what you see. The question at that point becomes very simple. Do we actually know the answer to that? Can we explain it clearly? And does what we're doing match with what we've told people that we are doing? Because that's the part that really matters when it comes to GDPR compliance. It's not whether you've got a privacy policy. It's not whether you've ticked a box somewhere or asked someone else to tick a box. It's whether your reality lines up with what you've actually said you're doing. And in a lot of cases, it doesn't fully. Not because you've done anything wrong or you've gone wrong in an obvious way, but because things haven't been looked at properly either at the beginning or in quite some time. A really common example is email lists. Most businesses have one and they build over time. People sign up through the website, they get added after events. Sometimes they're added through conversations or referrals. Sometimes we don't know how we've been added. And at the start, it's all quite clear, but over time, it becomes less clear where everyone came from, what they signed up for, and what they're actually expecting from that email list. And then the business starts using that list in different ways. So it might send updates, marketing, announcements, maybe slightly different content to what was originally intended or promised. And again, none of that feels like a problem. It just feels like normal business activity, things that founders are thinking about all the time. But if you actually step back and look at it, the question is, do we know why each of these people is on this email list? Do we know what we've told them? Do we know what we're relying on to contact them? That's known as a lawful base. And if someone asked about that, could we properly explain it in a clear way? Another example is how data is stored. A lot of businesses have data in multiple places. Email systems, CRMs, spreadsheets, internal documents. Different people have access to different things, sometimes more broadly than they need. And again, this isn't usually deliberate, it's just grown that way. But if you look at it from the outside looking in, it can raise some questions. Who has access to what? Why do they have that access? Is that really necessary? Is that access controlled? These are some of the key questions, and most businesses just don't have a clear answer to that. Not because they're doing anything wrong, but because it hasn't always been a priority for them. Retention is another area that gets overlooked. Data tends to be kept indefinitely because it might be useful, because there's no immediate reason to remove it, because there's no trigger to actually cleanse the data that a business holds. But GDPR expects you to have some thought around how long you keep things and why. Not in a really complicated way, but just in a way that makes sense. If someone asked about it, could you explain why you still have their data from 5 years ago? Would that answer be clear? Would it make sense? These are the kind of questions that don't come up day to day, but they sit there in the background. And when they do come up, they can be quite difficult for a business owner to answer, particularly if you haven't thought about them in advance or given thought to it for quite some time. And this is really the pattern across all of GDPR and what it requires. It's not about catching people out on technicalities, it's about whether your business makes sense when you look at how it handles data on a day-to-day basis. Whether there's a clear link between what you're doing and why you're doing it, and whether you can explain that link. That's what it comes down to. And the reason this can become a challenge for small businesses in particular is not because this is an inherently complex topic or concept, but it's because it doesn't really feel urgent. There's always something that's more immediate, and I get it. Clients, revenue, growth, operations. GDPR sits slightly to the side of all of that. It gets pushed down the list. It's not always ignored, but it's just not fully addressed. And that's fine for a while, but the risk builds in the background, and it's something that founders at some point will have to address. Not through one big mistake, but through lots of small things that haven't really been properly aligned. And that's why it often feels like GDPR is suddenly becoming an issue out of nowhere, when actually the underlying gaps have been there for quite a while. They just haven't been visible and they haven't had a light shone on them. But once they're visible, you're no longer building things properly from the start. You're trying to explain, you're trying to sometimes fix what's already there, which is always more difficult. If you strip all of this back, what actually matters really is quite simple. You need to understand your own business. You need to understand where data comes in, what you do with it, where it sits, who has access to it, and how long you keep it. And you need to make sure that what you say about that, whether it's in your privacy policy, a contract, or anywhere else, matches the reality of the situation. That's it. It's not about perfection. It's not about having this spot on. It's not about having everything locked down in a really rigid way. It's about being able to explain your approach clearly and having it make sense. Because if it makes sense, it's much easier to deal with any questions, any issues, anything that comes up from a client, from a regulator, from anyone. If it doesn't, that's where things become more complicated than they need to be. And that's usually the point where people realise that what felt like a small background issue is actually much more central to how the business operates. Because it was never really about the document in the first place. It was about the way the business was handling something fundamental without fully thinking it through. And that's why GDPR keeps coming up as an issue for small businesses. It's not because it is inherently difficult, we've already said this, but it's because it's easy to assume it's been dealt with when actually it hasn't been looked at properly ever or in quite some time. And that's where the gap is.